At 28 years old and 7 months pregnant, Emily Carter stood in the freezing snow with $11, a battered suitcase, and nowhere to sleep. Pregnant and evicted. She believed she had finally lost everything until an old abandoned bookstore became her only shelter. She expected nothing more than warmth for one night. But behind a dusty bookshelf, Emily discovered a hidden archive sealed away for years. Then she saw one folder that made her hands tremble. Written across it was the name of her dead husband. What was Daniel hiding before he died? And why did someone desperately want Emily to leave Bellwood before she discovered the truth? What would you do if you were carrying a child, had $11 to your name, and suddenly discovered that the only door you had ever called home was no longer yours to open? For 28-year-old Emily Carter, it was not a question she had time to answer. It was simply what happened. The landlord placed her 2 cardboard boxes on the snow-covered sidewalk, then set her battered brown suitcase beside them. Emily stood there in a faded wool coat that no longer closed around her 7-month pregnancy, watching snow settle quietly on everything she had left in the world. "Please," she whispered, one hand resting over her unborn child. "Just until the baby comes. I'll find work. I'll pay you back." The landlord looked away. "You've already had 3 months, Emily." Then the door closed. The lock turned. And just like that, she was homeless. 5 months earlier, her husband, Daniel, had left for his morning shift at the local factory and never returned. They called his death an accident. Emily had been too shattered to question it. Since then, she had sold her wedding china, Daniel's tools, and eventually even her wedding ring, just to buy groceries and pay what rent she could. Now there was nothing left to sell. By nightfall, the temperature had fallen below freezing. Emily walked through the empty streets of Bellwood, Pennsylvania, carrying her suitcase with one hand while protecting her belly with the other. Then, at the forgotten end of Willow Street, she saw something through the falling snow. An abandoned bookstore? Its windows were dark. Its bricks were cracked. Above the entrance hung a crooked wooden sign. Hawthorne Books Est, 1891. Emily had no idea why, but she stopped. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was providence. Or maybe some forgotten places wait patiently for the right broken person to find them. Behind the building, Emily discovered a shattered basement window. She stared into the darkness for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though there was no one there to hear her. "I just need somewhere warm for my baby." Then she climbed inside. Emily believed she had found shelter for one freezing night. She did not yet know that somewhere beyond those dusty shelves was a hidden archive bearing her dead husband's name. And once she opened it, everything she believed about Daniel's death and about the life waiting for her child would begin to change. The broken basement window was barely wide enough for Emily to squeeze through. For one frightening moment, her coat caught on a jagged piece of glass. She froze, instinctively wrapping both arms around her stomach. "Easy," she whispered to the child inside her. "Mama's got you." She did not know whether she was reassuring the baby or herself. When her feet finally touched the floor, darkness swallowed her. The bookstore smelled of dust, damp wood, and old paper. Somewhere in the walls, winter wind whistled through a crack. Emily stood perfectly still until her eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight leaking through the dirty windows. Then she saw them. Books. Hundreds of them. Perhaps thousands. They filled towering shelves from floor to ceiling, their faded spines disappearing into shadow. Some had fallen into piles. Others lay open beneath blankets of dust, as though someone had stopped reading in the middle of a sentence and simply never returned. Emily found an old sofa near the back wall. One cushion had been torn open by mice, but the other was dry. That was enough. She lowered herself carefully and pulled Daniel's old scarf from her suitcase. She had kept it because it still carried the faintest trace of him, or perhaps she only imagined it did. That night, Emily wrapped the scarf around her shoulders and cried without making a sound. "I don't know what I'm doing. Daniel," she whispered. Her hand moved slowly across her belly. "I'm trying. God knows I'm trying." The baby kicked. Emily closed her eyes. That tiny movement was enough to keep her from falling apart. By morning, she understood something terrifying. One night would not solve anything. She still had $11. She still had no home. And no employer in Bellwood seemed eager to hire a woman who might give birth within weeks. So Emily made herself a promise. She would stay in the bookstore only until she could find somewhere safer. And if she was going to hide there, she would take care of the place. She began with a broom. Day after day. She swept away years of dust, carried broken furniture into the basement, and covered the shattered window with a piece of plywood. She discovered an old cast-iron stove in the rear room, and, after several attempts, managed to coax a small fire from scraps of wood. For the first time since Daniel died, Emily had something resembling a routine. But the bookstore held questions. Behind the front counter, she found an old photograph of a silver-haired man standing proudly beneath the Hawthorne Books sign. Written on the back were 3 words. Samuel Whitmore, 1947. A neighbor eventually told Emily that Samuel had owned the bookstore for decades. He had died years earlier, leaving no known family. Since then, taxes and legal disputes had kept the building abandoned. Now the bank wanted it cleared, possibly demolished. Emily looked around at the shelves she had begun cleaning. Another unwanted thing waiting to be thrown away. She understood that feeling. Then something strange happened. One evening, while searching the rear shelves for something to read, Emily felt a cold current of air brush across her ankles. She stopped. The windows were covered. The back door was shut. Still, the cold air continued. It seemed to be coming from behind an enormous bookcase pressed against the far wall. Emily stepped closer. The shelf was filled with old encyclopedias and leather-bound volumes. Nothing about it seemed unusual until she looked down. There were scratches across the wooden floor. Long, deep scratches, as though the entire bookcase had been moved backward and forward many times. Emily's heartbeat quickened. She placed both hands against the shelf and pushed. Nothing? She pushed harder. Pain tightened across her lower back, forcing her to stop. "No," she murmured. "Not worth hurting you." She rested both hands over her stomach. But now she could not stop looking at those marks. The next morning, Emily removed the books one by one. It took hours. When the final volume came down, she pushed again. This time, the bookcase moved. Only an inch. But that inch was enough. Behind it was not brick. There was a narrow steel door hidden inside the wall. No handle. No window. Only a small keyhole. Emily stared at it, feeling something she had not felt since Daniel died. Not fear. Curiosity? She searched the counter, drawers, desk, and boxes in the basement, but found no key. Then, late that afternoon, she noticed one peculiar book sitting alone on the highest shelf. Its title was almost completely worn away. Emily opened it. The pages had been cut out from the center, creating a hollow compartment. Inside lay a small brass key. Her fingers began to tremble. Emily returned to the hidden door. The key slid into the lock as though it had been waiting for her. One turn. A click. The door slowly opened. Beyond it was a windowless room filled with filing cabinets, wooden boxes, photographs, letters, and carefully labeled folders. Emily stepped inside. On the nearest desk sat a handwritten note beneath a thick layer of dust. Some stories disappear because people forget them. Others disappear because someone wants them forgotten. A chill passed through her. Then Emily noticed a row of boxes along the far wall. Each carried a family name. She moved her finger across them slowly. Bennett, Harris, Miller, Crawford. Then her hand stopped. Her breath disappeared. Because written across one faded folder, in Samuel Whitmore's careful handwriting, were two words Emily had never expected to see inside that abandoned bookstore. Daniel Carter. Her dead husband's name. Emily did not touch the folder at first. She simply stared at it. Daniel Carter. Her husband had been dead for 5 months. His clothes were gone. His tools had been sold. Even his side of the bed had become something Emily trained herself not to look at. And yet here, inside a secret room hidden behind an abandoned bookstore, his name was waiting for her. "No," she whispered. Her knees weakened. Emily lowered herself into the old wooden chair beside the desk, one hand gripping its edge, the other pressed protectively against her stomach. The baby moved. That small movement brought her back. With trembling fingers, she pulled the folder toward her. Inside were copies of factory reports, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and several photographs. One showed Daniel standing outside the Bellwood Manufacturing Company beside 3 other workers. Emily touched his face. He was smiling. For a moment, the hidden archive disappeared. She remembered Sunday mornings when Daniel would burn the pancakes and insist they tasted better that way. She remembered him kneeling beside their bed after learning she was pregnant, pressing his ear against her stomach, even though the baby was far too small for him to hear anything. And she remembered the last morning. "I'll be home before supper," he had said. He never came home. Emily wiped her eyes and forced herself to keep reading. The first pages appeared ordinary maintenance records, safety complaints, equipment inspections. Then she noticed the dates. Daniel had begun collecting them nearly 3 months before his death. One report described a damaged pressure system on the factory's main production floor. Another warned that continued operation could result in catastrophic failure. Across the bottom was a handwritten note. Management notified, repairs postponed due to cost. Emily's stomach tightened. The official letter she had received after Daniel's death had said there had been no prior indication of mechanical danger. But someone had known. Daniel had known. She turned another page. There was a statement written in Daniel's handwriting. Emily recognized it immediately. She had seen that same slightly crooked script on grocery lists and birthday cards. 3 men have already been hurt. They keep telling us the equipment is safe. It isn't. Emily covered her mouth. The room suddenly felt too small. She kept reading. Daniel had apparently begun meeting Samuel Whitmore at Hawthorne Books. Samuel had helped workers preserve copies of documents they feared might disappear. But Samuel had died years earlier. So who had Daniel been meeting? Emily searched deeper into the folder until a small envelope slipped onto the floor. On the front was written, "For Emily, if I cannot tell her myself." Her breath caught. "Daniel?" She opened it. The letter inside was unfinished. Daniel wrote that he had discovered records showing the company had ignored repeated warnings about dangerous machinery. He feared people would lose their jobs or worse if no one spoke. Then came the words that broke her. "Emily, I know you're afraid about the baby. So am I. But I want our child to grow up knowing his father didn't look away when people were being hurt." Emily could no longer see the page. Tears fell onto Daniel's handwriting. For 5 months, she had carried a private anger toward him. Why had he left her? Why had he gone to work that morning? Why hadn't he somehow been more careful? Now she understood. Daniel had been afraid too. He had simply been afraid of something greater than death. He had been afraid that silence would allow another family to receive the same knock at the door. Emily pressed the letter against her chest and sobbed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Then she noticed something else inside the envelope. A brass locker key. A number had been stamped into it. 372. Beneath it was a final handwritten line. If anything happens to me, Samuel's archive isn't the end. Locker 317 contains the originals. Don't trust the company copies. Emily froze. The documents surrounding her were only duplicates. Somewhere else were the originals. And if Daniel had deliberately hidden them, then before his death, he must have believed someone would try to destroy the evidence. A sound suddenly came from the bookstore. Emily stopped breathing. A floorboard creaked. Then another. Someone was inside. She extinguished the small lamp and stood perfectly still in the darkness, clutching Daniel's letter against her chest. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor beyond the hidden door. Slow. Deliberate. Searching. Then a man's voice broke the silence. Mrs. Carter. Emily's blood turned cold. No one in Bellwood was supposed to know she was there. And almost no one alive was supposed to know that this room existed. Yet whoever had just entered Hawthorne Books seemed to know both. The footsteps stopped just outside the hidden room. Emily stood in complete darkness, one hand pressed over her mouth, the other holding Daniel's unfinished letter against her chest. Mrs. Carter. The voice came again. Older, male, careful, not angry. But Emily had learned that danger did not always announce itself with anger. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide. There was nowhere. Then the baby kicked hard beneath her ribs. Emily flinched. A stack of papers slipped from the desk and scattered across the floor. Silence. Then the hidden door opened. Light spilled into the archive. Emily raised an old metal letter opener with both hands. Don't come any closer. The man standing in the doorway froze. He looked to be in his late 60s, wearing a dark overcoat dusted with snow. His silver hair was wet from the weather, and his expression changed the moment he saw Emily's swollen belly. Good Lord, he whispered. You're pregnant. Who are you? The man slowly raised his hands. My name is Henry Bennett. Emily's eyes flicked toward the boxes along the wall. She had seen that name. Bennett. Henry noticed. So you found Samuel's archive? How do you know about this place? For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his eyes fell upon the letter in Emily's hand. His face went pale. Is that Daniel's? Emily tightened her grip on the letter opener. You knew my husband? Henry closed his eyes briefly. Yes. That single word changed the air in the room. He explained that he had been Samuel Whitmore's attorney and closest friend. After Samuel's death, Henry had quietly helped protect the archive. Daniel had come to him months earlier with evidence from Bellwood Manufacturing. Daniel had been frightened. Not for himself. For Emily. For their baby. He made me promise something. Henry said. Emily swallowed. What? That if anything happened to him, I wouldn't bring you into this unless the evidence could protect you instead of destroy you. Emily felt anger rise through her grief. So everyone knew except me. No, Henry said softly. Daniel wanted you to have a life outside this fight. A life. Her voice cracked. I sold my wedding ring to buy food. I was thrown into the snow carrying his child. What life did he think he was protecting? Henry had no answer. And somehow, his silence hurt more than an excuse would have. Emily turned away. For months. She had believed Daniel's death was simply another cruel thing life had taken from her. Now she saw something different. Daniel had made choices she had never known about. Samuel had protected voices other people wanted silenced. Henry had carried promises through years of fear. And Emily. Emily had spent 5 months believing survival meant keeping her head down. Do not complain. Do not ask questions. Do not make powerful people angry. Take whatever work you can get. Accept whatever explanation you're given. Be grateful for whatever mercy someone offers. It was how poor people survived. It was how women like her survived. But standing inside that hidden archive, Emily suddenly understood the terrible price of that kind of survival. Silence protected someone. Just not people like Daniel. Her eyes returned to the shelves. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of ordinary families. "What are all these?" she asked. Henry stepped beside her. People Samuel believed deserved to be remembered. He pulled down one box. Inside were eviction notices, land deeds, letters, and photographs. Families pushed from their homes. Workers injured and quietly dismissed. Widows denied compensation. People without money or influence whose stories had disappeared because no newspaper considered them important enough. Emily slowly looked around the room again. She had thought she had discovered a collection of old papers. She was wrong. This room was filled with people who had once stood exactly where she stood now, frightened, powerless, and hoping someone would believe them. Then she remembered the key. Emily opened her palm. 3 go to 7-8. Henry's expression changed immediately. "Where did you get that?" It was with Daniel's letter. She told him about the originals. For the first time, genuine fear appeared in Henry's eyes. "Emily, if those documents still exist, there are people who would pay a great deal to make sure they never become public." Emily instinctively covered her belly. A few days earlier, those words would have sent her running. But where would she run now? She had already lost her husband, her home, nearly everything she owned. And still her child was coming. Emily looked down at Daniel's handwriting. For months she had asked herself why life kept taking things from her. Now another question rose inside her. What if she had survived because there was something she still needed to do? "I want to find locker 317, she said. Henry stared at her. "Daniel tried to keep you out of this." "I know." "Then why risk it?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because someday my child is going to ask me who his father was." She placed Daniel's letter over her heart. "And I refused to tell him that his father died trying to expose the truth, while his mother was too afraid to finish what he started." For the first time since Daniel's death, Emily did not feel like a widow waiting for life to happen to her. She felt like his partner again. And somewhere in Bellwood, behind the lock marked 317, the truth was waiting. By sunrise, Emily had made her decision. She would find locker 317. Henry tried once more to persuade her to wait. "You're 7 months pregnant," he said as they stood beside the cold stove in the bookstore. "And if Daniel was right, these are not people who will simply apologize when the truth comes out." Emily looked at him. "Mr. Bennett, yesterday I was sleeping in an abandoned building because I had nowhere else to go. What exactly am I waiting to become safe from?" Henry had no answer. The number stamped on the key gave them their first clue. Bellwood Union Station had hundreds of rental lockers, many dating back decades. Locker 317 was there. That afternoon, Henry drove Emily through streets still buried beneath dirty snow. The station stood at the edge of town, its enormous clock frozen several minutes behind the hour. Inside, Emily could hear every sound, the scrape of shoes, the distant whistle of a train, the nervous beating of her own heart. They found locker 317 near the end of a narrow corridor. Emily inserted the key. For one terrible second, it would not turn. Then, click. Inside was a small metal case. Nothing else. Emily carried it to a bench and opened it. There were original safety reports bearing company signatures, photographs of damaged machinery, payroll records, and handwritten statements from injured workers. Henry examined the documents one by one. His expression grew increasingly grave. "This is enough to prove they knew," he whispered. Emily stared at him. "Knew what?" "That the machine that killed Daniel was unsafe." The word struck harder than she expected. She had known it was possible. Knowing was different from hearing someone say it aloud. Henry pulled out another document. This inspection was signed 6 weeks before Daniel died. They were ordered to shut the system down. Then why didn't they? Henry looked at her. Because shutting it down would have cost money. Emily turned away. Her hand went to her stomach. Daniel had died because someone had looked at a dangerous machine, looked at the cost of repairing it, and decided the money mattered more. Then she saw something beneath the reports. A sealed envelope. Her name was written across it. Emily. She recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, then I failed to come home. She stopped. Henry quietly moved away. Emily continued. Daniel wrote that he had discovered something larger than unsafe machinery. Bellwood Manufacturing had been purchasing properties surrounding the factory through intermediaries, pressuring struggling families to sell for almost nothing. Some of those names were the same names Emily had seen in Samuel's archive. The factory scandal and the hidden archive were connected. Then came Daniel's final request. Don't spend your life fighting because you think you owe me something. You owe me nothing. Live. Raise our child somewhere. Kindness is not mistaken for weakness. And if these papers can help someone who has no voice, use them. Not for revenge. For them. Emily lowered the letter. She cried quietly. Not the broken sobs of the night she lost him. These tears were different. They carried grief, but also something she had not felt in months. Purpose. Henry returned and sat beside her. There's more you should know. Samuel Whitmore's estate had never been properly settled. Hawthorne Books was scheduled for foreclosure, but Samuel had created a charitable trust before his death. The bookstore could be preserved if someone could demonstrate that the archive was still serving its original purpose, protecting local history and helping families whose stories had been buried. Emily stared at him. What does that mean? It means, Henry said slowly, the bookstore may not have to be demolished. For a moment, Emily could not speak. The place she had entered illegally because she was freezing might actually survive. But Henry wasn't finished. If we authenticate Daniel's documents and connect them to Samuel's records, we can petition the court to preserve the building and reopen the trust. Emily almost laughed at the impossibility of it. Who would run it? Henry looked directly at her. You could. Emily stared at him. I'm homeless. You found the archive? I have $11. You protected it. I was a secretary before I married Daniel. I don't know anything about running a bookstore. Henry smiled faintly. Neither did Samuel when he began. Emily looked down at her belly. Yesterday, she had been searching for somewhere to sleep. Today, someone was suggesting that the abandoned building might become something more than shelter. A home, perhaps even a future. But the opportunity came with a price. The evidence would have to become public. Bellwood Manufacturing was the largest employer in town. Powerful men depended upon it. Families depended upon it. Some people would see Emily as a widow seeking justice. Others would see her as a threat to their livelihoods. Henry closed the metal case. If we do this, Emily, there's no quiet way back. She thought about Daniel, about the families in Samuel's archive, about her baby entering a world where powerful people could erase the truth simply because frightened people remained silent. Then she remembered the night she climbed through the broken bookstore window. She had asked only for warmth. Instead, she had found a reason to stand again. Emily placed Daniel's letter inside her coat. Then we don't go back, she said. Henry nodded. And as they walked out of the station, Emily did not yet notice the black sedan parked across the street. She did not see the man behind the windshield watching them. But he had seen the metal case. And before Emily and Henry reached Hawthorne Books, someone at Bellwood Manufacturing already knew that locker 3 had been opened. The warning came before breakfast. Emily woke to the sound of glass breaking downstairs. For one terrified second, she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. Hawthorne Books. Daniel's letter. Locker 3-17. The black sedan. She pushed herself upright from the narrow cot she had made behind the counter. Her back ached, and the baby felt heavy beneath her ribs. She listened. "Nothing. Stay with me. Little one," she whispered, pressing a hand against her belly. Slowly, Emily walked toward the front of the bookstore. A brick lay on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper. Emily bent carefully and picked it up. 4 words had been written in thick black ink. "Leave Bellwood while you can." Her hands began to shake. For months, Emily had lived with fear. Fear of losing Daniel. Fear of giving birth alone. Fear of bills she could not pay. Fear of becoming homeless. But this was different. Someone wanted her afraid. And that realization changed something inside her. Henry arrived less than an hour later. The moment he saw the broken window, his face hardened. "You can't stay here. Where should I go? I can arrange somewhere. And the archive, we'll secure it." Emily looked at him. "No. Emily. No." Her voice surprised even her. She walked toward the hidden room and looked at the shelves filled with forgotten names. "If I leave because someone throws a brick through a window, what happens to all of this?" Henry lowered his voice. "This isn't only about you anymore. You have a child to think about." Emily's eyes filled. "Everything I do is because I'm thinking about my child?" She pulled Daniel's letter from her coat. "I spent months believing being a good mother meant staying quiet, keeping my head down, taking whatever people gave me and being grateful for it." Her voice trembled. "But what am I teaching my son if I let fear decide what kind of life we're allowed to have?" Henry said nothing. That afternoon, Emily made a decision. She opened the bookstore's front door. Not for business. Not yet. She placed a handwritten sign in the window. "If your family has a story connected to Bellwood Manufacturing or Hawthorne Books, please come inside." For nearly 2 hours, no one came. Emily began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Then the bell above the door rang. An elderly woman entered. Her name was Grace Miller. "My husband worked at Bellwood for 32 years. She said he lost 3 fingers on a machine they knew was broken. Emily led her to the archive. There was a box marked Miller. Grace opened it. Inside was a copy of the complaint her husband had filed nearly 20 years earlier. Grace stared at the paper. Then she began to cry. They told him there was no record. More people came. A retired machinist named Owen Parker brought photographs of unsafe equipment. A widow named Hannah Lewis carried letters her husband had written before dying from injuries sustained at the factory. A father arrived with an eviction notice from a home his family had been pressured to sell. By sunset, Hawthorne Books was no longer silent. People stood between the dusty shelves telling stories they had carried alone for years. And Emily listened. That was when she finally understood Samuel Whitmore's archive. It had never been about paper. It was about giving people proof that their suffering had happened. Proof that they had mattered. 3 days later, Bellwood Manufacturing sent a representative. His name was Charles Mercer. His suit probably cost more than everything Emily owned. He placed an envelope on the counter. "What is this?" Emily asked. A solution. Inside was a check. $25,000? Emily stared at it. $25,000. Enough to rent a proper home. Enough for hospital bills. Enough to buy a crib, warm clothes, food. Enough to stop being afraid every time she counted the dollars in her pocket. "All we ask," Mercer said calmly, "is that you surrender the documents belonging to the company and leave Bellwood." Emily's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. For one painful moment, she imagined saying yes. A warm apartment. A safe nursery. No threats. No broken windows. Then the bookstore bell rang. Grace Miller entered carrying a casserole covered with a towel. Behind her came Owen with lumber to repair the window. Then Hannah arrived carrying a tiny knitted blanket. "For the baby," she said. Emily looked around. These people had almost nothing, yet they were giving what they had. Suddenly, the check on the counter looked very small. Emily pushed it back toward Mercer. "My husband died because somebody decided money mattered more than people." Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "I won't make the same decision." Mercer's expression changed. "You should think carefully." "I have—" After he left, Emily locked the door and leaned against it. Her knees trembled. She was still afraid. That was the part nobody told you about courage. Courage did not make fear disappear. Sometimes courage was simply deciding that something else mattered more. That evening, Henry arrived carrying court documents. He placed them before Emily with a smile she had never seen on his face before. "The petition has been accepted." Emily stared at him. What petition? To preserve Hawthorne books under Samuel's charitable trust. She could barely breathe. Henry continued. "The court wants a temporary steward while the case is reviewed." Emily looked around at the bookstore. "At whom?" Henry smiled. "You." Tears immediately filled her eyes. Weeks earlier, she had climbed through a broken basement window apologizing for needing one night of shelter. Now the same building was being entrusted to her care. Emily lowered herself into a chair and cried. Not because everything was suddenly easy. It wasn't. There were still threats ahead. There was still a powerful company determined to bury Daniel's evidence. And Emily still had no idea how she would raise a child while fighting any of it. But for the first time, she was no longer asking, "Who will save me?" She was asking something entirely different. "Who can I help now that I survived?" Then Henry placed one final document on the table. His expression became serious again. "There's something else." Emily looked up. "What?" "The court hearing has been scheduled." "When?" "Monday morning." Emily glanced at the calendar. 4 days. Henry hesitated. "And Bellwood Manufacturing is challenging Daniel's evidence." Emily felt her heart sink. "On what grounds?" Henry looked directly at her. "They're claiming Daniel Carter stole those documents and that everything inside locker 317 was fabricated." Emily stared at her husband's letter. After everything she had discovered, there was one battle left that could destroy it all. To save the archive, protect Daniel's name, and secure a future for her child, Emily would have to stand in a courtroom against the most powerful company in Bellwood. And this time, she could not hide behind a locked door. Monday morning arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Emily stood outside the Bellwood County Courthouse, with one hand beneath her belly and the other wrapped around Daniel's final letter. She had barely slept. The baby had been restless all night, and every few hours Emily had awakened with the same terrible thought. What if they win? Bellwood Manufacturing had money, attorneys, influence, and decades of power behind its name. Emily had a borrowed maternity dress. $11 she still refused to spend unless absolutely necessary, and a dead man's promise folded inside her coat. Henry met her at the courthouse steps. "You don't have to be fearless today," he said quietly. Emily looked at him. "I'm not." "Good." Henry offered his arm. "You only have to tell the truth." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Emily recognized faces from Hawthorne books. Grace Miller, Owen Parker, Hannah Lewis, families whose names had spent years hidden inside Samuel Whitmore's archive. Even people who had once crossed the street to avoid Emily were there. Bellwood Manufacturing's attorneys argued first. They called Daniel a disgruntled employee. They suggested the documents had been stolen. Then came the accusation Emily had feared most. They implied that a desperate, homeless widow had discovered the papers and invented a scandal because she needed money. Emily felt every eye turn toward her. For a moment, shame returned with brutal familiarity. She remembered standing in the snow while her landlord locked the door. She remembered climbing through the bookstore window like a criminal. Maybe that was all people would ever see. A poor woman desperate enough to do anything. Then Grace reached forward from the bench behind her and gently touched Emily's shoulder. Emily turned. The elderly woman said nothing. She didn't need to. Emily looked around the courtroom. These people had come because someone had finally preserved what happened to them. She stood. When asked why she had refused Bellwood Manufacturing's $25,000 offer, Emily removed the check from Daniel's folder and placed it before the judge. Because my husband died after someone decided saving money was more important than saving lives. The courtroom became silent. I was offered more money than I have ever seen, Emily continued. And I wanted it. Her voice cracked. I wanted a warm home for my baby. I wanted to stop wondering whether I could afford food next week. She looked toward the company representatives. But Daniel left me something worth more than that. She placed his letter beside the check. He left me the truth. Henry then presented the original inspection reports from Locker 317. Signatures were authenticated. Dates were confirmed. Former employees testified. Owen described machines operating despite repeated safety complaints. Grace produced her husband's rejected claim. Hannah read part of a letter her husband had written after being injured. One voice became 2. 2 became 10! By afternoon, the case was no longer about Daniel Carter. It was about an entire community that had been taught its suffering did not matter. The judge did not settle every claim that day. That would take months. But he made 2 decisions that changed everything. The documents were admitted for further investigation, and Hawthorne Books was granted protection under Samuel Whitmore's charitable trust. Emily Carter was confirmed as its steward. Emily lowered her head and cried. Daniel's name had not been cleared completely. Not yet. But it would no longer be erased. Neither would theirs. 3 months later, on a warm spring morning, Emily stood inside Hawthorne Books holding her newborn son. She had named him Samuel Daniel Carter. The bookstore looked nothing like the freezing ruin she had entered that winter. The broken windows had been replaced. Owen repaired the shelves. Grace organized donated books. Henry helped establish a community legal desk where struggling families could receive guidance without charge. Upstairs, volunteers created a reading room. And behind the great bookcase, the hidden archive remained. But its door was no longer hidden. A small brass plaque now read, "The Whitmore Archive, every story deserves to be remembered." Emily carried her son inside. She stopped before Daniel's box. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she kissed her baby's forehead. "Your daddy wanted you to know he didn't look away." Her voice broke. "And neither will we." Outside, the bell above the bookstore door rang. Children entered looking for books. Older workers came carrying photographs and letters. Families brought pieces of their histories to preserve. The building that had once been abandoned was alive again. So was Emily. She walked to the front window and looked across Willow Street. Months earlier, she had stood in the snow believing she had reached the end of her life. She understood now that sometimes life does not rescue us by returning what we lost. Sometimes it places something broken in our path and quietly asks, "Can you love this back to life?" Emily had entered Hawthorne Books because she needed shelter. But the bookstore had given her something far greater than a roof. It gave her Daniel's truth. It gave forgotten people a voice. It gave her child a story about the father he would never meet. And it gave Emily a reason to believe that losing everything did not mean she had become nothing. Sometimes the place you enter because you have nowhere else to go becomes the very place from which your new life begins. Emily's story reminds us that sometimes the moment we believe we have lost everything is the moment life quietly begins giving us something new. She entered Hawthorne Books as a frightened, pregnant widow with $11 in her pocket and nowhere to sleep. She was not searching for justice, purpose, or a second chance. She simply wanted to keep her unborn child warm through one freezing night. But that night changed everything. Emily learned that courage does not mean living without fear. Sometimes courage is being terrified and still refusing to walk away from what is right. She could have taken the money and disappeared. Instead, she chose truth over comfort, protected the forgotten stories of others, and transformed the place that once sheltered her into a place of hope for an entire community. Perhaps that is the lesson worth remembering. When life closes one door, do not assume your story is over. Sometimes another door is waiting in the most unexpected place. If Emily's journey touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story of courage, hope, and second chances. And I especially want to hear from you in the comments. If you were Emily, would you have accepted the $25,000 and walked away or risked everything to fight for the truth? Share your answer below. Someone reading your words today may need exactly the encouragement you have to give.